Let me show you a blitz game between Robert James Fischer and Wolfgang Uhlmann from 1970. Two pawn sacrifices, one of them genuinely beautiful, and a finish where a single white pawn walks up the board and takes something it has no business touching. The setting is the Herceg Novi Blitz tournament, 5 minutes each, and the opening is the French defense, the sharp Winawer branch. Let's begin. We open with e4, and Uhlmann answers e6, the French. The pawn steps up to d4, met immediately by d5. The knight comes to c3, and out comes bishop to b4, tying that knight to the king on the dark diagonal. This is the Winawer, and the argument is already about that knight. So Fischer asks the question the other way round. With a3, he offers the bishop a choice: retreat or trade itself for the knight, and hand white a doubled pawn plus the two bishops. Uhlmann takes it, bishop takes c3 with check, the pawn recaptures on c3, and pawn takes e4 collects the center. With the black king still unhoused, Fischer throws the queen out to g4, eyeing e4 and more rudely g7. Uhlmann defends the pawn in the most modern way. He doesn't. Knight to f6 develops and dares white to grab it, and Fischer does grab it. Queen takes g7, hitting the knight on f6 and the rook in the corner at the same time. This is the main line, and both sides know exactly where they are. Rook to g8 saves the corner and turns the tables. Now the queen is the piece being chased. She steps back to h6, still leaning on the knight along the diagonal. The rook slides to g6, nudging her again and taking aim down the g-file at g2. So the queen retreats once more to e3, where she watches that stray pawn on e4. Uhlmann brings the knight to c6, pressing on d4, and the bishop takes the long diagonal at b2. Then comes b6, preparing to develop the light-squared bishop, but it is slow, and in a position this open slow costs something. Fischer castles queenside, king tucked behind the pawns on the side where his rook will do the most good. The bishop appears on b7, staring at that long diagonal from the other end. Then h3, a small move, and not the sharpest here. Uhlmann grabs space with h5, though the pawn he gains is a pawn he will now have to keep feeding. The pawn goes to c4, building a broad center. The queen comes to d6. The last knight develops to e2, and Uhlmann castles queenside as well. Both kings on the same wing, both a little airy. Now the knight jumps to f4, prodding the rook on g6. It steps back to g8, and the position settles. The bishop drops to e2, and suddenly it and the knight are both looking at that advanced pawn on h5. Uhlmann shuffles the queen to e7. It looks natural. She leaves the d-file. She guards f7, but remember where she is standing, because it matters enormously in about 10 moves. Why was the knight the better piece to put there? Because knight to e7 keeps h5 defended and gets the last piece into the game, leaving the queen where she is safe rather than where she can be hit. But the queen went there instead, and Fischer wastes no time. The center cracks open with d5, hitting the knight on c6. Pawn takes d5 in reply, straight into the teeth of the rook on d1, and pawn takes d5 restores the wedge, poking the knight again. The knight leaps into e5, planted right in front of the bishop on the long diagonal. Fischer supports the wedge with c4, and the bishop swings around to a6, leaning on that new pawn. So the queen drops back to c3, taking over the long diagonal and lining up on the c-file, where the black king lives. The f6 knight steps back to d7, holding e5 and abandoning h5. And now the first gift. The pawn goes to d6, offered to two different black pieces. Fischer isn't counting pawns. He is counting open lines towards c8. Uhlmann takes with the c-pawn, which opens his own king's front door and leaves the d-file pointing at that new pawn on d6. Let's stop here, because this is the moment. White is a shade better, nothing more, and materially white has just given something away for free. Look at the geometry. The rook on d1 runs the whole file to the pawn on d6. The queen on c3 sits on the c-file with the black king at the end of it, and the black queen is parked on e7. Now what would you play? There is a move here that offers a second pawn purely to open the c-file and the diagonal at once. Pause the video and try to find it. I'll show you. Here it is. The pawn steps to c5. 3 black pieces can capture it, and it doesn't matter, because if the b pawn or a knight takes, the c file cracks open, and the king on c8 is looking straight down the barrel of the queen. That is the second pawn Fischer has handed over in 3 moves. So sit with this for a second. Black is the one holding the extra material, and white is the one who is better. That tells you everything about what the pawns bought. The rook on d1 still runs the length of the file to d6. The queen still owns the c file. And black has a bishop on a6 hunting the bishop on e2, which is exactly the sort of tempting, tidy little capture that wins material and loses games. The question Uhlmann has to answer is not which piece can I take, it is whose king is in more danger. What would you be worried about here? He took the bishop. Bishop takes e2, snapping off a piece and hitting the rook on d1, and it is the move that throws the game away, because it does nothing at all about the pawn standing on c5 and the file behind it. So what should he have done instead? Take the sacrificed pawn with the knight. Knight takes c5 and the position stays a fight. White grabs the bishop with bishop takes a6 check, and black is worse but very much alive. That is not the game. Uhlmann grabbed the bishop first, and here is what the extra piece is worth. White is winning comfortably. The pawn on c5 is still alive and the c file is still loaded. The rook on d1 still stares down toward d6, and the black king sits on c8 with no cover. Most importantly, that black queen is still sitting on e7, the square she chose 10 moves ago. Watch where white's pawn is heading. Pawn takes d6 arrives with check, opening the c file at last. The queen on c3 now looks straight through to the king on c8, and there is no piece that can capture the checking pawn. Uhlmann blocks with knight to c5, and that knight is now nailed to the c file, unable to step aside without exposing the king, which frees the pawn. Pawn takes e7, a pawn taking the queen. There is nothing better than a spite check. Rook takes d1, forking the king on c1 and the rook on h1. Fischer recaptures, rook takes d1, and the bishop takes d1 in turn. Black has rook and bishop for the queen, but the pieces are scattered and the knight on c5 still cannot move. So the queen helps herself. Queen takes e5, collecting the second knight and leaving the bishop on d1 stranded. It runs to a4. The king steps calmly to b1, and the bishop reroutes again to c6, which lets things get worse. What was there instead? Pushing the pawn with e3 at least creates a little chaos in front of white's king. White takes it, pawn takes e3, black tidies with king to b7, and after queen to d5 with check white is still winning, just with more work to do. That resource stayed on the shelf. Instead, the knight hops to d5, offering itself in the middle. Before we see the reply, look at this honestly. White is winning by a distance, queen and 2 knights worth of pressure against a bishop and 2 rooks that have never coordinated once. Black's only real asset is the rook on g8, which runs the whole file down to the loose pawn on g2. So the question is simple, does Uhlmann take the knight on d5? Because the moment that bishop leaves c6, the light squares around his king belong to white, and the queen is 1 move from arriving. What do you think happens if he takes? He takes. Bishop takes d5 removes the knight, and with it, the last piece guarding anything. From here, white has a forced mate. The game is simply over as a contest. Was there anything else? Knight to e6 keeps the bishop on the board and the king breathing. Still losing, but still a game. But that is not what happened. And look at the wreckage. The bishop on d5 hangs to the queen with nothing defending it. Black's rooks are on g8 and nowhere useful, and the king on c8 has no shelter of any kind. Only the pawn on g2 is loose for white, and there is no time to collect it. 1 recapture and the whole thing collapses. Queen takes d5, and that was that. Uhlmann resigned here. He stopped because he had a queen's worth of material missing with a bare king on c8, no defenders near it, and a white queen already inside the position. And the thing that decided it was the smallest piece on the board. Fischer gave away 2 pawns in 3 moves so that one of the survivors could march c4, c5, d6, and finally e7, where it captured a queen that had chosen that square herself. If you take one idea from this game, take that. A pawn offered to open a file toward the enemy king is not a pawn lost, it is a lane bought, and lanes are what checkmate travels on. Thanks for watching Nocturne Chess. If you enjoyed this game, subscribe for more quiet journeys through chess history. Until the next board, good night.